Hi, my name's Ryan Heath, and I'm here today with Sarah Perna, and we're going to talk about living trust, also known as revocable living trust, and just covering the basics today on those trust documents.
Okay, so starting simple, can you just tell me what a living trust is, Ryan?
Sure. A living trust, again, also referred to as a revocable living trust, it's simply a tool for estate planners. And so if you have a living trust, then that document will have many of the same provisions and address the same situations that a will does. So your trust would choose how your property passes when you die and who it passes to. The trust would also designate a succession of managers that would step in and take care of financial matters for you if you were unable to take care of those things for yourself.
Can you run us through some of the benefits of what a living trust is?
Sure. A living trust has many benefits. First, and one of the key things that clients ask about when they come into the office is that if you set up a trust and you fully fund the trust, in that scenario, you can avoid the court probate process, which is the process that a will goes through after someone dies to appoint an executor and get the assets passed down to the beneficiaries.
Okay, so before we get too far, can you talk a little bit about what it means to fund a trust?
Sure. So funding the trust is the process of transferring the ownership of your assets from your personal names into the name of the trust. So I like to think of it as kind of a basket on the table, right? And right now your assets are spread out all across the table, and the goal is to create this basket, which is the trust, and then take the assets and put them into the basket. And so that's done differently depending on the type of asset. We'll cover that in a later video. But the purpose of funding is to change the ownership of the assets to the trust so we can achieve the objectives of setting up the trust in the first place.
Okay, so once all of my assets are inside the trust, how does that impact my everyday life?
Your everyday life is really not going to change once you put assets in the trust. So there's no separate income tax filings for a living trust. Your homestead and property tax exemptions all stay in place. There are no state filings like LLCs and business entities have. And so the only real difference that clients feel when they set up a living trust is that their bank statements list the trust as the owner instead of their personal names. And when they get that lovely property tax appraisal notice in the mail, it has the name of the trust as well. But besides that, they can keep their names on their checks. They don't have to have the trust name. And they can have checks written to them in their personal names, not made out to the trust.
Okay, so we talked about probate avoidance, but what about any other benefits of a living trust?
Sure. So there are, again, many other benefits to a living trust. Just to name a few, one is incapacity planning. And so as we continue to live longer, there are greater concerns about things like Alzheimer's, dementia, or stroke or other illness where we can't take care of our finances. And so by having a trust in place, we name successor trustees that can step in, pay bills for you, make sure that your bills are paid, that medical providers are paid, kids are taken care of, all without having to rely on financial powers of attorney. So without a trust, you're forced to rely on these powers of attorney, and many times they work just fine. But recently, some banks and other financial institutions have started to require specific forms for their bank in order to access an account. And so that's great if we know it ahead of time and can access the account. But if there's an emergency and we don't have that form in place, the financial power of attorney may not be effective. So in that event, the trust can avoid that issue.
You mentioned probate avoidance and incapacity planning. Are there any other benefits you want to mention?
Sure. So one third benefit is that by setting up a trust, you can protect beneficiaries from themselves. And what I mean by that is by funding assets into a trust and keeping the inheritance in trust for a child, the inheritance is protected both from spouses and from creditors, so like a car accident and things like that. And also for a beneficiary that is not financially responsible or not capable of managing their own finances, the trust can name someone else to be in charge of their trust as far as distributions are concerned.
Okay, so we talked about the pros. What about the cons?
Really, the key downside to a trust or the burden of creating a trust is the steps you have to take after the trust is created to get it funded. And so oftentimes that may mean 2 or 3 trips to the local bank or financial institution, really trying to find the proper party that knows how to retitle the trust. And so that is a bit of a pain. It is a little bit of work, but I always tell clients, once the trust is ultimately set up and the accounts are transferred, the trust operates on autopilot after that.
And now that I know a little bit more about this, how do I know if I need one?
Sure. So a trust is not for everyone. And oftentimes clients come in thinking they need a trust or that they just need a will. And after we talk through these 5 or 6 factors, they often realize that their original plan may have been a little bit misguided. And so there are 5 or 6 key factors that I look at to determine whether or not a trust is appropriate for a client. First, if a client has a net worth of $3 million or more, a living trust can be very beneficial from a tax planning perspective. Secondly, many of our clients have properties located out of state, whether it's a beach home or a vacation house. And in those instances, a living trust is beneficial because it can avoid probate in multiple states. So usually, if you own a house in Texas and Colorado, there'd be a probate here in Texas and a probate in Colorado. If the properties are owned in the trust, then there's no need for probate in either state for those properties. Third, we have a lot of clients now that have blended families. And what I mean by blended families is that you've got a husband and wife or spouses that have children from prior marriages. And so in that event where there is a blended family, we have the ability to set aside assets for the surviving spouse for their lifetime, but also ensure that when that surviving spouse dies, the first spouse's wishes are ultimately fulfilled. Fourth is if we have a child with special needs, especially children with special needs that qualify for government benefits. In that instance, we want to make sure that trust distributions do not disqualify those children from those benefits. And so the trust can be structured in a way to avoid disqualification. And lastly is kind of our catch-all provision. And that is even if you don't meet one of the other criteria, but you have enough assets after factoring in life insurance and things like that, that you wouldn't want your beneficiaries to receive all of that property outright at a relatively young age.
This has been very helpful. Do you have any last comments or suggestions?
Yeah. So in addition to getting your assets funded into the trust, it's really important that you start thinking about consolidating the information related to your assets. And so I always say that in the event you passed away, especially if you're married and you and your spouse both passed away in a common accident, how is your executor or your trustee going to step in and know where to locate your assets? We need a treasure map, right? We need a list of where the bank accounts are located, who the key contacts are, your CPA, your financial advisor, your attorney, and also what passwords do we need in order to access key information. And so at a minimum, you should at least have your email account and your password written down and updated and kept somewhere safe, preferably with your estate planning documents, so that if there is an emergency, we can access all the financial information we need to be able to provide for your loved ones, children, or your beneficiaries.
For sure. Thanks, Ryan.
And so with that, that's all we wanted to cover today with Estate Planning Living Trust 101.